to invite Willem over to speak for us today. So please, a big round of applause for Willem.
So my name is Willem Hoekstra. I've lived in Hong Kong for about 12 years, before that in Singapore. I currently work for Kroll, but I've been working in different banks for the last 20 odd years. And starting in finance, so doing accounting, and then moved on to be the business manager of the COO, which meant that the COO is responsible for everything. So everything you can imagine on the back office of the bank was his responsibility. And I was his business manager, which meant that everything that smelled a little bit like real work automatically moved onto my desk. And he could cut the ribbons and so. And one of the things that I got involved with, that I suddenly became responsible for, was business continuity management. I'm talking about, about 20 years ago. I didn't really know what it was. But then, we were working in an office in Amsterdam, a pretty large office, about 3,500 people were working there in the Zuidas, for the people that are familiar with the Netherlands. The Zuidas of Amsterdam. And in the core, in the heart of this building, was our dealing room, our trading floor, which looked like this. So nicely designed. It was a building from Renzo Piano. I know there's some designers here, so you're probably familiar with that. Pretty nice building that was built around 1999. And this again is the heart of the organization. So as a bank, this is where all the money markets come together, where all your capital markets come together, where all your derivatives markets come together, all these other things globally come together here. It's a pretty big bank, ABN AMRO at the time, 120,000 people in 52 countries around the world. And again, this is the heart of it. So if this would fail, the whole world would have a problem. And not just ABN AMRO, but it was also a systemic risk to the entire world, effectively, to the financial markets, if this would go down. So when they designed it, they really thought nothing should ever go wrong, right? This is critical. That meant that, for example, every desk that you see here was coded either red or green. If it was coded red, all the cabling came in from the one side of the building and from one telco company. And when I speak about all the cabling, it's both the data cabling as well as the voice cabling, which were of course separate from each other. Whereas if it was coded, what did I say, red or green, the other one, then of course all the cabling came in from the other side of the building. And it was a different telco company. So if something would go wrong to one of those telcos or to their cables, then only half of the desks would be unavailable, unserviceable, but at least the half of it would still work. Now, similarly, they were looking at, your fire extinguisher, your sprinkler installation. You can see those little nozzles, they have to melt, right? If there's a lot of heat, they will melt, and that's when they start sprinkling. Because on a floor like this, you don't want to get water unless you really need it, right? Also, there was a data center at the basement below this one. So again, water should not be there. Also, the cabling was underneath, so you just don't want to have water there if it's not really, really necessary. So instead of having these kind of nozzles that have to melt, they had a dry system, meaning that there were two smoke alarms that had to go off at the same time. Only then the valve would open, water would come into the pipes, then they still have to melt, and then you would get water. So if there's a real fire, it works, but otherwise it would be perfectly safe. So very nice, that worked, that was installed. On the 17th of September, which I believe is a Friday, so the next day, on the 18th of September, 2004, they were testing the smoke alarms. They have to do that every so often. And they have these little machines they put on top of the smoke alarm. By the way, where is the alarms here?
Mm-hmm. They are here.
You've been through it. Okay. I think it's you. Anyway, so what they have is these little machines they put on top of it. The little light starts burning, and then you know that the smoke alarm works. Right? Now, how they did it, we still don't know, but they managed to set up two smoke alarms at the same time during the test. Still shouldn't be a problem. The system worked, the valve opens, water came into the pipes, but still these nozzles have to melt, right? So it should be okay. Unfortunately, I'm talking here about 2004, the building is now 5 years old. In these 5 years, there was a lot of air in all these pipes, these metal pipes, and a little bit of moist. What do you get? Moist, air, metal, starts corroding. If you then push in 16 bars of water, it breaks. So the main pipes, the main water pipes of the sprinkler installation broke. And water, thousands and thousands of liters of water dispersed over the ceiling. And it was one of those lowered ceilings with the little holes in it. So effectively it spread out and it started raining on the trading floor. And this is what it looked like the next day. Fortunately, it was a Saturday. So soon after, actually half of the ceiling here came down. but there was nobody working anymore. On the Saturday, of course, there was nobody working, so nobody got injured. But yeah, as you may understand, this was a little bit of a problem. And this was my first introduction into business continuity management. If you think it cannot go wrong because it is totally secure with double safeties, it will go wrong sooner or later. So that's what business continuity management, my first introduction was. By the way, were we able to deal with this? Well, yes, because we had plans. We didn't have a plan for this specific event, but we did have a plan for when the trading floor would not be available. We had an alternative site where people could work from. In this very specific case, about 48 desks. In total, there were about 650 desks on that trading floor. 45 of them now were totally destroyed. The desks, they were all custom made, but the chipboard was completely twisted, had to be thrown away. The computers were like aquariums. Really, I've got some pictures as well where the water just comes out of the computers. It was really, really bad. But 48 desks were not serviceable anymore, so we could move those people to other parts of the trading floor, and those people that were working there we could put to other parts of the organization. So we had enough flexibility, agility to deal with that situation. And that's what the theme is about today, critical. What is critical? And how critical is it actually? So if you are a risk manager, you could spend a whole lot of time trying to analyze which of these dogs is going to bite first, and which of these dogs is going to bite the fiercest, the hardest, and the most damaging. You could do that. Now, personally, I don't think that's too useful, because we know that one of them is going to bite. So why don't we prepare us for all of that, instead of looking at the individual risks? So rather than trying to predict what's going to happen, you try to make generic plans and build the agility, that word was used before, build the agility, build the flexibility to deal with the situation like that. And by the way, what's most interesting I still find is, if that little cat would be a bank, typically, you can see the cat is not really worried about the dogs. He's more worried that his feet are getting wet. He doesn't even see the risks, which is so typical for banks as well. So rather than planning for specific events that may happen, what you can also do is just plan for the agility of the organization. What do you need as a bank to operate? You need buildings, you need people, you need IT, and you need vendors. That's all you need. You also need a bit of clients and capital, but let's leave those out of the equation for now. But facility-wise, these are the main facilities. So rather than predicting the specific event that may go wrong, you can prepare yourself for the consequence, which is an unavailability of one of these elements. So let's quickly look at the different flavors that we have here. Unavailability of building. I already just mentioned the trading floor and sprinkler installation issue. But in my career, that trading floor incident was just the first of a long range of incidents. You shouldn't hire me because drama will happen. We had a situation, for example, with a letter arriving with white powder in it. And it arrived at the mailing room. They didn't know what to do with it, so they took the letter, and whilst it was still pouring with white powder, they walked through the building to the security office, which was like 3 floors away, spreading out whatever there was in there. The security officers didn't know what to do with it, so they phoned the police. The police came. They didn't know what to do with it, so they closed down the building. So now you've got a building of 3,500 people. Nobody's allowed to come in. Nobody's allowed to go out. And this is our head office with the big customers and everything. Unavailability of building, which could also be demonstrations outside, like we've had here in Hong Kong, which could also be in Menkers, which could be, anything could cause your building not to be available. And it can be very small things. In our Singapore office, which was at the 40th floor, the elevator broke down. It's very simple. Yeah, people are willing to walk once, but not twice to the 40th floor. So anything can happen while your building is not available, and that's what you can plan for. The same with IT. It doesn't matter if it's a cyber attack or just a crash of your data center, or maybe the air conditioning doesn't work anymore in your data center. What are you going to do if IT doesn't work? And the solution is not necessarily more IT. It's not only about IT backups and disaster recovery and all that. It's how are you going to keep your customers happy when IT doesn't work? Is there maybe a check we can write manually instead of using computers? I don't know. And the same, of course, with unavailability of people. Maybe they're on strike, maybe they're poached away. By the way, that happened as well. We had an office in Australia, and on a good Monday morning, the corporate finance team didn't show up anymore. You will like that story as a lawyer. The corporate finance team didn't show up anymore. Because what happened was they were all poached away, the whole team was poached away by Deutsche, I shouldn't have said that, by another bank. So yeah, unavailability of people, which could also be Mancrit, which could also be there on strike, which could be there on protesting, or maybe there is indeed a pandemic disease going around and all your people are sick. How are you going to deal with that? That's what you can plan for. And lastly, the unavailability of vendors and suppliers, which includes, by the way, if you have an offshore center, for example, in India, like most banks nowadays have, they have a remote offshore center. What do you do if that is not available? That is what you can plan for without predicting the actual event. So the way we do this, and now it's getting a little bit technical, I'll go very quickly over this. We have a methodology as business continuity professionals, so this is not specifically to any organization, where you start with a business impact analysis. Very simple, what is really essential to our company? What really hurts if we don't have it anymore? What kind of service must be provided? And to give you a very simple example, we were having the discussion, Mark and myself, like, how critical is it for me to be here today? I'm like the main gig, right? Mm. So, it would be a disaster if I wasn't here. Well, is that so? What would be the plan B? The plan B, if the speaker doesn't show up, is that he has a backup presentation he can do. And even if he doesn't do that, you guys can just mingle and have a drink and you'll still be happy, right? There's, sorry that you cancel last moment. It's not going to be the end of the organization. You will show up next time when there is one. So yes, it would be nasty and it shouldn't happen too often, but it's not the end of the world. And we find a lot of that in our organizations as well. Like people think it's an absolute drama, an absolute disaster if something doesn't work. But actually, if you think of it, if for example you don't do your financial reporting to the authorities, yes, it's nasty, but most of the time you just get a slap on the wrist. If you're late with payment, you just have to pay an overnight interest rate. The interest rate nowadays is negative, so you can make a profit out of that. Now, joking apart, salaries, HR departments always think that payment of salary is like absolutely essential, that it happens on time. Now, if your salary is 1 day late or even a week late, and your company actually explains the reason why, that this is very exceptional, we're very sorry, we highly apologize. If you need any cash, we'll write you a check. Can you please survive? You're probably okay with that, right? So first assess what is like really, really critical. There's that word again. What is like really essential, and understanding the organization in that sense. What is the impact? If you can't do that, is where you start. You then start building solutions. Let me just see if I have another. No. Yeah, building solutions. So what are those solutions that you can do? A lot of them. If you have an IT outage, you can have IT disaster recovery, of course. Have a backup sheet, very simple like that. If your computers don't work, maybe you can have a manual workaround. You can just use paper-based actions and just continue that way. So there's a whole lot of things. Transference is another example. If your team can't operate anymore because of the people outage or whatever, then maybe there's another team or a consultant or somebody else can take over. Now, if you prepare that in advance, it will work, and then you probably should test it as well. Once you have those plans, those solutions in place, you can then make the actual business continuity plan, writing it down so everybody knows what's going to happen, and then test it and review it. But then again, there's always the situation of the swan. Until around 1700, I think it was 1697, if I'm not mistaken, the only swans in the entire world were white. And that was the proven evidence that swans were always white. They couldn't be black. So there was a proverb in English expressing the black swan, meaning something that couldn't happen because it doesn't exist. And then indeed, around just before 1700, was a Dutch guy, by the way, Mr. de Vlaming, who suddenly arrived in the the west side of Australia. And if you go to the Perth area, black swans are actually quite common. And they had to change the proverb. So instead of black swan being something that doesn't exist because it has never been observed, suddenly it was like, well, we thought it never existed, and now it does exist. So that's why a black swan nowadays is understood as that, as something you don't think will exist, but actually it does exist. So there are these unexpected events. And how do you deal with that? Well, that's where crisis management comes in. So far I've been talking about planning for the unexpected, but now we're going to plan for the really unexpected, the things that you couldn't even imagine to be possible. Giving structure to crisis management. If a situation like what I started with in ABN AMRO happens, a lot of the senior managers, they panic. And what do you do if you panic? You get whoever happens to walk outside of your room, into your room, and you start making decisions straight away. You don't really know what's going on, you don't really know how bad it is, you don't really know if the right people are in the room, etc., etc. So you can structure that. So rather than using your intuition, you now use a checklist. By the way, as a hobby, I fly a small airplane. I'm a pilot, it's a private pilot license. And when you're a pilot, actually flying an airplane is not that difficult. Landing is a bit tricky, but taking off and so on flying is quite easy. The difficulty and what most of your training is about is when there is an interruption of your aircraft, when the engine stops working. That's what you train for, and that's what most of the time is spent on. And what are the alternatives? If one of your instruments doesn't work, how can you use the other instruments to sort of cover up for that? So that's the fun of it. And all of that works by checklist, because intuition is the worst advisor in a crisis. Do not trust your intuition, especially not when you're a pilot. Trust your instruments. So how do you plan for that as a corporation, as an organization? First of all, establish the team. So the team means who is part of the crisis management team. And again, I've been to so many organizations where I ask people, are you a member of the crisis management team? And this is like a senior manager, are you a member of the crisis management team? And their answer is usually, I think I am. Very convincing. Or I should be, another one of my favorite. And the third one is, what is a crisis management team? Yeah. So if there's a real crisis, you don't want to have that argument. It has to be crystal clear who is in charge now, who should come together, and only those people should come together. Establish an escalation structure. Have you ever heard of the boiling frog? The boiling frog? Frog is, and by the way, if I speak too long, you will stop me. A boiling frog. A frog, as you know, is cold-blooded. Okay? So if you put it in a pot of cold water, it will be very happy and it will swim around. If you throw it into a pot of very hot water, it will immediately jump out because it's too hot. If, however, you put it in a pot of cold water and you slowly heat it up, because it's cold-blooded, it doesn't notice that, it doesn't feel that, and it will stay in there until it's boiled. It won't jump out. Now, that is the typical boiling frog syndrome that you find in corporates and in your private life perhaps as well. Like, something is a crisis, but it slowly develops. So it starts with something that's quite manageable, a little fire in the corner, but before you know it, the entire building is on fire. And there was not that trigger moment, there was not that, scary moment that you start calling the fire brigade, and you forget doing that. So having the escalation structure of when this crisis management team should get together, having those triggers, those thresholds, defined really helps. The agenda, I'll come back to that. So what is that checklist we now have to go through in order to manage this situation? I'll come back to that. Crisis status, well, you sometimes hear that, our company is essential services only. That's a status definition. Yeah? Let me skip that for now. Crisis communication, I'll also come back to that, is of course extremely important. Having clear roles and responsibility during a crisis, that is a checklist again. Who's going to do what? Don't assume that somebody will do something, because before you know it, it doesn't get done. The business priorities, let's focus on the same items. Emergency response, this is more about the health and safety of people, making sure that, if a bomb explodes, that we have the right procedures around that. Emergency notification, are we able to communicate with all our staff if it's necessary? Most banks, they have an automated system for that. All the contact details of all staff members are in that central system. And when you push the button, a message will be automatically sent out to everybody, which is a combination of SMS, a combination of emails. You can have an app that it goes through, and it can also send out voice messages. And it can have multiple devices, so your private mobile phone, as well as your landline phone, as well as your corporate phone, as well as your email address, your private email address, your corporate email address. All of that is plugged into that system. And therefore, if there's a real crisis, the system will be able to find you. The last time I've used that in anger was when in the UK there was a bomb threat. Actually, it went off on Tower Bridge, and our office was at Angel Lane, it was Namur, just around the corner there. It happened during lunchtime, so we were very concerned about our staff. So we sent that message out, and people could respond automatically again to that system, and therefore we very rapidly, within half an hour or so, could make sure that everybody was accounted for and everybody was safe. The solutions I spoke about, and let's skip that. So, how do you make those decisions, the best decisions, when there is a crisis? And why should you not trust your intuition? Well, first of all, we now get the team around the table, and this person thinks we should do that, and that person thinks we should do that. And okay, let's agree, we're going to do that. But now this person comes in with some other ideas and new information, so let's do something different. And before you know it, nobody knows who's doing what anymore. Yeah? And that's typical crisis, right? We're all full of adrenaline, and we don't know what we're doing, and that's what's happening. So starting with the logistics, having somebody to take the minutes, scribe, somebody to take minutes and just note down what we have agreed upon. And actually a room like this would be wonderful because you can actually write down what we have agreed and wipe out if it's no longer agreed when there's changes. So having somebody look at that really helps. Secondly, the roll call. Making sure that we've got the right people in the room and only the right people in the room. So having a list for that really helps. Situational awareness. Now, I remember during the Fukushima events, we had a big office in Japan. In Japan, I was working for Société Générale, a French bank at the time. That was a big problem because the Japanese authorities said it's perfectly safe to stay in Tokyo. There's no problem, despite what happened at the Fukushima nuclear power plant. You remember, by the way, there was a huge earthquake followed by a tsunami, caused a lot of devastation in the north. A lot of people lost their lives. Really horrible. We were lucky in the sense that in Tokyo the impact was relatively small. It was a huge earthquake, of course, but there was no flooding or so in Tokyo itself. The biggest problem there was the Fukushima power plant. The first issue there is that there was some load shedding, so there was scheduled power outages, which in Japan are quite uncommon. So we did not really have a generator, we didn't have a plan for that. But secondly, there was the threat of the nuclear fallout, the radiation. And the problem there was that the French have a somewhat love-hate relationship with nuclear events. Anybody French here? Yeah. So you know what I'm talking about. Okay. Then I will not dwell on that. But yeah, no, situational awareness. So the issue there was, it was very unclear how dangerous it actually was. The Japanese said it's perfectly safe to stay here. The Americans said it was not safe, you should leave. And the French were a bit ambiguous on that, to the point that the French Association of Businessmen, that was closely associated with the embassy, but not the same as the embassy. So the association said, well, if you're pregnant, maybe you should leave the country. Which for most of the French people meant, hey, it's the embassy that tells us we have to leave straight away. That was a bit of an issue, also because of cultural reasons, by the way. Because, you know, in most countries that I'm familiar with, the health and safety of your family comes first, right? That's A number one. Your own health and safety probably comes second, quite close to it. Your company is, you know, of a completely different order. I don't care about my company when my own health and safety is at stake. However, in Japan, for many people, are you Japanese here? No? Okay. In Japan, it's slightly different because your company is seen a little bit as your family. So you're expecting your family to help you out when you're in a crisis. In this case as well, the company was expected to help their people in Japan that were working there. So a complete cultural, you know, mismatch between a French company operating in Japan. When the French then left, a lot of the French left, it felt for many people as if their father left during a crisis, and that many of those people were not welcome back anymore. I'm diverting a little bit. Coming back to situational awareness. So what was the reality there? How dangerous was it? When the Americans say that it's not safe, when the Japanese say that it is safe, when the French say, well, probably should be leaving, and we had a situation where somebody walked into our crisis management team and said, I'm sure we have to evacuate because my neighbor knows somebody who used to work in a power plant and they told us that. Now, how reliable is that source, right? And again, in a crisis, you will have a lot of that. Nowadays, with social media, there's all sorts of shit going around as to, you know, what is a reality? What is a reliable source of information? And you could use companies like International SOS or Control Risks who are reliable sources of information. Impact assessment. What does this mean to the situation right now? And only then you start agreeing on actions. Because now we have the right people in the room, we have a joint situational awareness, we agree as to what the situation is based upon reliable sources, and now we can take actions. instead of starting with agreeing on actions right from the start with God knows whoever is in the room. Yeah? No, I'm going to skip that. So, yeah, good point. Crisis communication. So what we teach people here is how to make statements, media statements when there's a crisis. And this is actually my favorite. State the facts, show sympathy, praise the helpers, state the next actions. If you listen to any crisis communicator in the news, you will hear this formula. If you go and watch the news tonight, you will see that official spokespeople always use this. Yeah? It's always like state the facts. At 5 p.m. last night, we were informed that there was a fire on the 31st floor of our building. Show sympathy. 3 people have been taken to the hospital. We sympathize with their families and loved ones who are now worried about their health and blah, blah, blah. Praise the helpers, the fire brigade, the police service, whoever, our own staff who's been working overtime. Wonderful job. And you state the next actions. Tomorrow the CMT will come together, the crisis management team will come together, and we'll take stock of the situation. They will never speculate and they will never blame anyone, because this is not the right time to do that. And the real formula about that, because journalists will try to prompt people to say that they don't want to say. If you hear a good trained spokesperson, they will say what they want to say, so using that formula, they will say it again, and then they will say what they just said. They will stick to their own guns. They will not go into, but don't you think that, you should have prepared better? They will not go into that. They will just say it again what they just said. Okay? And we do training on that. Let me skip most of this, but this is more about, we use again aviation, so from the pilot as well as the military, to maximize the ability to make the right decisions under extremely difficult circumstances. So in decision making, there's elements there like cognitive bias. Like why are some people afraid of flying, but they're not afraid of getting into a taxi in Hong Kong, whereas the death rate is a lot higher in the one than in the other. Back here, I still remember, it was one of my favorites, an interview with a farmer in Fukushima. So the radiation went around, and they were interviewing this guy. Like, are you not afraid? And how does it impact? He said, yeah, I'm really sorry, I lost my crop, I can't sell my crop anymore. But aren't you afraid about your health? He said, I'm very afraid of my health because I may get cancer, and it's bad. During that interview, which took about 5 minutes, he smoked 10 cigarettes. Are you afraid of cancer? So again, decision making and the situational awareness are key elements in crisis management. Don't be led by phobia, don't be led by intuition, but be led by actual facts and statistics and all that. That's what we're saying with that. And we can train on that. And then crisis communication. So this is what that is all about. Now, one way of really doing that is what Mark referred to as well, is the crisis management exercises. So simulation exercises. We do exercises with banks, you see here on the right-hand side. So those are crisis management team, usually the very top management of an organization. We have a simulation team that is on our side, on the organizer's side, and we send them situation reports, emails, phone calls, well, the whole lot. And so we make an interactive, immersive environment for them, as if it was real, as if a crisis really happens. And they will have to deal with it. So they learn that way, they practice that way, they exercise that way in making sure they follow that agenda of crisis management, coming to the right decisions, having the right considerations, rather than immediately jumping into actions. But first consider all those elements. Again, intuition is not a good advisor. Checklists are. Because a checklist was drawn up when people can think about the best solutions. You have time to think about and consider all the different alternatives. In a crisis, it's adrenaline that's talking. Usually not a good idea. Yeah, what is critical? What is critical to you? What is critical to your organization? And one day you will find yourself like this little buddy, where you hope you were prepared. Because, if he has to pee and he hadn't prepared that, he's in trouble. And with that, I'd like to thank you.
Thank you, Willem. What I really love about Creative Mornings is diversity, Some of you guys were here last month. Last month our speaker was Swamini. The topic was spirituality, and we mainly discussed to trust your instinct, to go with your gut feeling. And right now we have Willem here saying, never ever trust your gut instinct and always go with your brain. For different reasons, but I absolutely love it. This is also the opportunity for you guys to ask any questions if you have any. Could be anything, could be about Willem being a pilot or about crisis management. Oh, we have one over there.
I don't know if I need the microphone. I can.
We have a camera.
Okay. I'm really interested in those training sessions because I've done a lot of that in my past with like remote medical issues in my wilderness EMT training. So it's all about simulated events. It's all about stressing everybody out, long hours, everything like that. And that was all when I was young. It was fun. It was a blast. Everybody dressed up in makeup. It was great. I can imagine when you're like kind of holding up a bank and triaging, a financial crisis. Things get really sweaty in that room. And I'm interested in the human experience of that as a leader. And you're meant to show up and make decisions. You're meant to, you're meant to do all these things. And now I need to go back to a checklist. And I'm with a group of my entire peers that all have that same ego and that same disposition. When you guys are doing that and doing that training, how are you coaching the individual growth, maybe the destruction of ego, everything that probably is kind of the fallout of that very sweaty room? What happens next?
Well, the best thing to do, of course, is not to just do it once. You do it over time, and you address different items in it. First of all, if we organize something like this, we make sure that everybody in the team will have something to do. So even if it's only an IT outage, there are ways of giving injects to make sure that everybody in the team has something to do. Even the person from HR, the person from legal, the person from compliance, the person from business operations. For example, it appears that it was actually a staff member who actually introduced the cyber attack. Or it was the person who clicked on the button that he shouldn't have done. Or your staff getting involved in social media. Now, HR now gets really busy because they have to deal with that stuff. So it's just one example. So we make sure that in different exercises, in different ways, everybody gets challenged. You do it multiple times, and you give them feedback, of course, afterwards. And some of them are more open to feedback than others, as you know. But generally, it works. Another thing I think that is important with these exercises is the cultural aspect. Especially here in Asia, we have a very diverse community, of course, and most of my ex-colleagues that would be regionally responsible for Asia. If you do an exercise like that in say the Netherlands, there would be a nice interaction between the chairperson and the people that are forming part of the team. If you do an exercise like that in, say, Japan or in Korea, there's a fair chance that, so you throw in an inject, building is on fire. What happens is that everybody's sitting there and they now look at the boss and ask for answers, wait for answers and instruction. Right? If, however, you go to India, and I'm wildly generalizing here, but if you go to India and you throw in an inject like, hey, the building is on fire, everybody starts discussing and giving their opinion and nobody listens to each other anymore. So again, it's very culturally bound as well in these trainings and exercises, which is great fun. Yeah, look, there is also that point that some people are better at role-playing and understanding that this is realistic. So understanding that they should take this seriously. Although we do find that over time, at first half hour people have to get used to it, after half an hour they get immersed and they start taking it very seriously. So it works, generally. But what you will definitely find is that some people flourish when they're under stress, whereas other people get really quiet and they don't know what to do anymore. And it's better to find that out during an exercise than in a real situation, of course. Yeah.
Do you see the roles ever change on the crisis management team? Where somebody just kind of tweaks or snaps and you're like, oh, yeah. Maybe we should reorganize and think about
typically these exercises,
sort of...
Yeah. No, typically these exercises can take 4 hours. Sometimes we do it for a full day even with a pretty long break in between. And people get tired. And very often we close it off, because it's a nice way of closing it off, with a press conference, where we actually invite real journalists and we prepare nasty questions ourselves as well. So now this person that has been concentrated on an issue already for the full day we now put him in front of a stand and a lot of people and asking difficult questions, and he has to respond to that. That's where you sometimes see them break down a bit, that they can't do it anymore, which is excellent to do that during an exercise, because that could really happen as well. And now you've got the whole world watching you, and it's not an exercise anymore. So again, it is building that experience like, hey, this was probably not a good idea. We should get somebody like a deputy or a backup or somebody from the communications team to do that. Also, what we find is we always ask people to have a deputy, and they don't really take it seriously. They think, yeah, my secretary can do that, and that's not working. And during practice, during rehearsals, they get really tired. We try to get the deputies in. It's the wrong person, and over time it improves.
Sounds like an amazing experience.
I love it, yes. The best part of my work. Actually, making the scenarios is the best part. I have a pretty evil mind. You can think of horrible things. Okay.
Anyone else?
One thing, I work in events, so we are trained for working events, so we are trained for trouble. We are constantly rigorous. But what I found is that you never work with your team. You work with freelancers, you work with clients that change, so you can never be ready for as perfectly as you think. So what I found it's really helpful is to send a message about what the principle. The principle is that I want nobody dead. The principle is that money will not matter, it will cost what it costs. Principle is that we will be transparent throughout. Because if you don't give because you cannot manage everything, and if you don't give the big principle of the picture of what we will do, I found it's almost like the philosophy of how you want this crisis to be dealt for. And I think this is not done often because a lot of this crisis management workshops are always templated, they're always the same. Okay.
We make them very
not
bespoke.
yours.
Yeah.
But the one
Very often they take them off the shelves. That's a cheap version.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I found that two things. First, understand behavior of people. And it's better to train me as a decision maker on behavior of people, so I know. I got one staff. She's always afraid. She will do the opposite of what I say because she's a little lamb that is so afraid of whatever I say, even if I'm the boss. So the philosophy, and then after that behaviors. Then after you can deal with people. But the last thing you haven't mentioned is legal. I found that a lot of time the trouble is legal. People don't want to write in case we are sued. People don't want to. But if you deal with American company, overgeneralizing, legal is the first issue. So do you want to share your experience with what I go through?
No, I love your contribution, and maybe we should discuss this a bit further in the break. Of course, this was a very brief introduction, and where I speak about communication. Of course, one of the main considerations in communication is that trade-off between having full transparency versus what you can say as a legal person. So in that formula that I said, you state the facts, you show sympathy, you praise the helpers, and you say your next actions, but you certainly don't blame. So in that formula, you can say that you sympathize with people that lost something, but you definitely don't say that you were guilty, that you were responsible for that. And that's where legal comes in. If you make holding statements, you can phrase the statements that legal is happy with it, and just use that template in a real situation. So that's an example of legal. The importance of legal, actually, she's left already. We had a corporate lawyer in the group here. Yes, legal is of course extremely important, but it's not the only one. You know that. If you talk about your reputation as an organization, that's really important as well. And then you've got your compliance reasons, and it depends on the situation. But legal is important. To the other point, I spoke a little bit here. I touched upon it. The individual, the way individuals respond to a crisis. That has to do with bias, with cognitive under stress, cognition under stress. So yes, we have a training course on that as well, going specifically into that point. It was quite a story you made actually. It's good. I loved working with the French, I have to say. It was a lovely the last point. Yeah, having the bold statements, like the principles, completely agree with you there. So having the clear statements of what are your business priorities. I did mention business priorities in here, but health and safety first is like paramount importance. And that should be your first statement for communication as well. That whatever happens, people's health and safety is our absolutely number one. The rest is secondary, per definition. Saying that money is not important is maybe, as a bank, not something you necessarily want to say, but that depends on the organization. So yeah, I agree with you. Yeah. Those are elements that all should be considered in this. Yeah. Working with freelancers, interesting. I don't know.
We are in new economy,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't have my regular team. So
Yeah.
I know if I have a crisis, I have to deal with people that have instruments.
Right. Yeah.
So any training is out of the window. And the ones that I got to be trained on, and I'm making decision, for example, that if anything happened to me, I just do a reserve director. It's free of charge, so anybody own an agency. It's free of charge. I have a reserve director that if I die, somebody can make checks.
Yeah.
You know, and you don't think about you not being available. That's why in meeting you often, for example, Shell, I work with Shell, super high quality for health and safety, super high quality. Just to let you know, for an event in Manila, they install seat belts to all the taxi that the people will take at the airport, and the mayor of Manila learned about safety because of that. And they, when you work with company like that, this high level of safety, they always make you rehearse.
Mm-hmm.
You cannot start a meeting without showing the exits and fire exits to people. But me, I'm working with people I've never met, so I have to find a way to instill the culture and make decisions. Like, I don't know. It's complicated.
Again, you're saying so many good things. So by the way, if you need a new speaker, I think that's.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, so the two things that you're mentioning. One, a team who has not been trained and not familiar with you. If you're the chairperson and you know what needs to be done, you know what the agenda is to follow, what the tick list is, the checklist that you can follow, you can dominate that very much. And by the way, you saw that agenda. It looks very bulky and like it's taking forever. It doesn't. You can do a crisis management meeting, a productive crisis management meeting within 5 minutes by going very quickly through that concept of that list. And that's what we can train the leader for, the chairperson. The other point of you being unavailable yourself, you getting lost for some reason as the chairperson, that is the critical staff outage plan. So I said at the beginning, you can plan for an outage of people, an unavailability of people. That includes two kinds of people. So one is when you have a volume problem. Your workforce is not there, how can you cope with that? Or a whole team is not available, how do you cope with that? The other one is critical individuals. So the only person that speaks French, the only person that has the authority to sign, the only person that is licensed to do something. If that person is not available, how do you deal with that? That's what you can plan for without it becoming a crisis.
Averting the crisis.
Yeah, I'd love to have the conversation with you.
I see your conversation continuing there. I do want to wrap it up. Doesn't mean that we have to go. There's still some time to grab a cup of coffee. But the last part of today is a little bit of participation, audience participation. So I need you guys sharp again. Now it's your time to actually show me that you're still active and here. And I'm going to teach you a Dutch word to say goodbye to Willem. And I'm going to teach you thank you. It goes in 3 steps. The whole word is dankjewel. So repeat after me and we'll do it in 3 steps. Dank. Je. Wel. One more time. Dank. Je. Wel. Okay, now the whole word. Dankjewel. Okay, here we go. Dankjewel Willem. Dankjewel Willem. Big round of applause.